just noticing the time, I think that we should probably go ahead and get started.
Oh, it's 6:32.
We have some attendees already here who can see us. So the way this evening is going to work technologically is that it's a webinar. So on the screen will be the panelists, and the attendees will not be visible, but can submit comments and connect with each other in the chat, and they can also submit questions in the Q&A. And Chase, please correct me if I've left anything out or got anything wrong there.
No, that's it. There is a third option. If attendees would like to verbally ask their question, they are welcome to do so. Just let in the chat, just let Jenny or I know, and we can put you, and we can mark you down, and we'll let you know when we're ready to give you microphone access to do that.
Okay. Wonderful. So shall we begin, Barbara?
Absolutely. This is good.
Okay, well, I just want to welcome everybody that is here to the panel discussion about the film Shared Legacies, this documentary. If you haven't watched it yet, if you've somehow on this call and you haven't seen it, you definitely should, and you still can through this evening. I will put the link and the password in the chat just in case you haven't gotten a chance to do that. My name is Jenny Williams, and I am the Assistant Director at Hillel at Florida State. We're a nonprofit organization that supports Jewish students at Florida State and actually FAMU and TCC. I'm excited to be here in conversation with three luminaries to talk about the content of this film, about the connection between the Black and Jewish communities, which of course also overlap, right? And in the civil rights movement, and then today, and talk about how the film sort of highlights all of that, but also how that intersects with our own lives and experiences. Barbara, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you everybody on the panel, and thank you for joining us tonight. I'm Barbara Goldstein, and I'm the Executive Director of the Holocaust Education Resource Council in Tallahassee. And we plan training programs for Holocaust educators and other community events like this. And we're very excited about tonight because this is actually showing more about how the importance is of the human story. It's about everybody's history and about everybody getting along. So on a personal note, both of my parents were Holocaust survivors. They both said that coming to this country was the most amazing thing for them because it gave them a sense of freedom that they never had when they were children. My father said the best day of his life was when he was liberated. So freedom constantly came through my brain, and I feel that this is such a connection of the freedom and the liberation of people as human beings today that we need to persevere. So I don't want to take up too much more time, and I want to now hear from the other people on the panel.
Yeah, if I could, I'll just go ahead and give introductions. Is that okay? So I want to introduce Doby L. Flowers. She is a graduate of Leon High School and a graduate of Florida State University with a BS in Social Welfare and Masters of Science in Urban and Regional Planning with a specialty in health planning. She also received a certificate of completion from Harvard, John F. Kennedy School of Government for the program for senior executives in state and local government. As a high school student, Doby was one of the early Black students to integrate Leon High School in Tallahassee, and went on to enroll at Florida State University at a time when there were less than 30 Black students out of a campus population of 18,000. While very active in campus social action, in 1971, Doby became the Black Student Union candidate for Homecoming Queen, a title which she won. She became the first African-American homecoming queen at Florida State University and one of the first in any Southern predominantly white university. As FSU's homecoming queen, right? She also became the first African-American in the Miss Florida USA contest. She is symbolically one of the subjects of the integration statue that stands in the middle of FSU's campus as a tribute to integration. Iconic. Immediately graduating from FSU with her master's degree, Doby moved to the Northeast, where she accrued progressive experience introducing and directing innovative large-scale public and private ventures. She worked for Mayor Kevin White in Boston for almost 10 years, with her last position being Deputy Director of Employment and Economic Policy Administration for the City of Boston. She was then recruited by Mayor Koch to New York City to head the Agency for Child Development, the largest agency of its kind in the nation. She was then tapped to assist in redesigning the entire welfare system for New York City and to develop and implement a new agency to oversee welfare reform for the City of New York. Mayor Koch tapped her to be the commissioner of the Human Resources Administration that was responsible for the entire social service system for the City of New York, with a budget of $5 billion. So just wanted to make sure I got that was a B and not an M. A staff of 50,000 and daily services to 1 million people. After leaving government, she was hired to develop and implement a global executive development department for W.R. Grace. And the relocation of the worldwide headquarters of that company from New York to Boca Raton, Florida, brought Doby back to Florida. After 5 years there, Doby decided to return to Tallahassee, where she has worked with her brother's firm, Flowers Law LLC, for the last 22 years. She's the owner of the Magnolia Leaf Bed and Business in Thomasville, Georgia. Doby Flowers is the co-founder of the Florida State University Civil Rights Institute, and we are so happy to have you here.
Happy to be here.
Thank you. And I will introduce our next panelist. Shanika Nik Harris, with she, they pronouns, is a genderqueer, non-conforming attorney, activist, and speaker. She's a native of Tallahassee, Florida, and obtained her undergraduate degree in political science from Florida A&M University and her law degree from FSU. She is licensed to practice law in Florida and Washington, D.C. Attorney Harris is currently the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services' first LGBTQ consumer advocate, through which she serves as the department's liaison to Florida's LGBTQ community, tongue twister, raises awareness on agriculture industry opportunities, and helps to address discrimination and fraud targeted at the community. This position was appointed by Commissioner Nikki Fried and is the first LGBTQ position to a member of the Florida cabinet. Prior to this appointment, she served as senior attorney at the Florida Department of Transportation and as a prosecutor at the Florida Department of Health. She conducts training on diversity, equity, and inclusion, and is certified by Cornell University in diversity and inclusion. She is the first Black woman elected to serve as vice chair of the Human Rights Campaign National Board of Governors. HRC is the largest civil rights organization in the country. She serves on the boards of Ruth's List and Ignite Women's Services, is vice president of the Dolphin Democrats, Broward County's LGBTQ Democratic Caucus, and vice president of the Florida LGBTQ Democratic Caucus, serves on Broward County Sheriff's Social Justice Task Force, and is a big in the Big Brothers Big Sisters Pride program. I do not know how you have time to sleep. In 2020, she was selected as a Victory Empowerment Fellow, one of 8 people selected from across the country. She was elected as a Biden presidential delegate in 2020, representing Florida's 22nd congressional district. One of her proudest achievements is the founding of Thou Art Women, a signature open mic event with her friend and fellow attorney, Gannett G. Wright. The event series celebrates LGBTQ women and their allies through performance and visual art. Attorney Harris has been the recipient of countless awards, including the 2019's Ruth's List Women Breaking the Glass Ceiling Award and 2020 recipient of the LGBTQ Leadership Award by the Florida Diversity Council. She's an award-winning Toastmaster and speaks across the country in support of equality. Her partner is Jasmine Lewis, an award-winning educator and activist. And she went to high school with me, so.
I did. That's the most important thing right there.
Dr. Davis Houck is the author of Public Speaking in the 21st Century, has spent the better part of the last 3 decades exploring the rhetorical dynamics of the Black freedom movement in the US. He's worked extensively on how the media shaped the narrative of the kidnap and lynching of Emmett Till. That scholarship continues with his work on the Emmett Till Memory Project, a digital app for smartphones designed to tell Till's story in the 21st century. Davis spent years, along with co-author and editor David Dixon, unearthing parts of the civil rights movement that have gone missing, publishing 3 books on long-forgotten speeches from local leaders who history has largely ignored, including a book on the women of the movement. His most recent book project is on Freedom Summer and the search for missing Black bodies. At his home on Florida State University's campus, Davis is the founder of the Emmett Till Archive, the only archive in the world dedicated exclusively to primary sources related to this foundation stone of American history. He's also the founding member of the FSU Civil Rights Institute, an interdisciplinary and community group that explores where policy, culture, and the past intersect with race on campus in Tallahassee and in the state of Florida. Thank you all so much for being here.
Thank you.
We are in the presence of greatness. And I think from here we should see if we have, well, I think it would be really nice maybe to start with a little bit from each of you about, before we move to questions, maybe if we could kind of go one by one and start with either your thoughts and reflections on this film in particular, why this panel resonates with you, what the Black Jewish community connection means to you. And I thought maybe Dr. Houck, we could start with you since you were.
Sure. Thank you, Jenny. Appreciate the introduction and sure to appreciate everybody tuning in this evening. I hate Zoom, but here we are. So we're going to make the best of it. And I'm sorry I look like a vampire. The lighting in my study is not optimal. I asked Barbara ahead of our meeting tonight what I should do, what I should prepare. And of course, the all important question, how long should I prepare? And she said no more than 5 minutes. And so having watched the film and I do not want to get on the wrong side of Barbara, I prepared my comments and I wrote them out because there's some very specific things I want to say about the film. And I'm happy, of course, to talk more about these comments in the Q&A, but I'll quickly read through these. I'm going to highlight some of the things in my very brief remarks and then focus on one segment of the film that intersects directly with some of my recent work. Jenny just mentioned it, the project on Freedom Summer and unnamed Black bodies. It actually shows up in the movie. And I confess to having a bit of archival and interviewing envy in watching Shared Legacies. As somebody who spends a lot of time in archives all over the country, this film goes down a bunch of archival rabbit holes and comes out with many treasures. You can pick almost any segment from the film, but I'd highlight the audio from the Milton Grafman speech, which he gave following the murder of 4 young Black girls at the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham. Dave Dixon and I reprinted that speech in our anthology on religion and the movement. We found the audio tapes of it at Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati after a good bit of snooping. The speech isn't particularly eloquent, nor is it particularly insightful theologically, but in terms of its emotional impact, it's devastating. And Grafman is still wounded by the fact that King, Martin Luther King that is, had singled him out in his letter from Birmingham jail. He's one of the 7. To be on the receiving end of a now canonical civic text by Dr. King would be hard. Couple that with the murder of 4 girls in church in your backyard, and yeah, Grafman doesn't attempt to hide his hurt. While the archival documents give Shared Legacies a scholarly cachet that's hard to resist, the on-screen interviews with civil rights legends like Andrew Young, Dr. William Anderson, Clarence Jones, C.T. Vivian, rest his soul, as well as children such as Susanna Heschel, Martin Luther King III, the Wachtels, the Rothschilds, we get a storytelling intimacy that's irresistible. And speaking of irresistible, Lonnie Bunch's story to start the narrative is not to be missed. The narrative arc of Shared Legacies is incredibly ambitious. About midway through the film, I started running parallel lines between the film and Eyes on the Prize. The two map onto each other rather neatly, from the Brown decision and the Montgomery bus boycott to the campaigns in Albany, Georgia, Birmingham, Alabama, St. Augustine, Florida, and Selma. Note that these 5 places are also places where Dr. King and his Southern Christian Leadership Conference organized, though it wasn't yet called that in Montgomery. Shared Legacies is a King-centric documentary, and that's not only warranted, but necessary. His ministry is exactly the right place to focus our attention. But our attention is not drawn to the civil rights alliance between Jews and SNCC, between Jews and CORE, or the Conference of Christian and Jews, between Jews and the Council of Federated Organizations in Mississippi. This is where future filmmakers will hopefully pick up the thread from Shared Legacies. There's a lot of work, I think, to do. Regarding COFO and Freedom Summer, Shared Legacies, not surprisingly, veers from Dr. King to talking about the murders of Goodman, Schwerner, and Cheney. I knew this was coming. I just didn't know where in the narrative it would fall. But at the 57-minute mark, we're introduced to Heather Booth, a volunteer during Freedom Summer. And she proceeds to tell us about unnamed Black bodies that were discovered across the state of Mississippi during the search for the 3 missing civil rights workers. I've spent the better part of the last 5 years chasing down this story. Were those unnamed and unidentified Black men and women whose bodies were discovered that summer? Where were they? Booth is far from alone in making these shocking claims. Other movement veterans, scholars, journalists, and filmmakers have made very similar claims. The Black bodies Booth refers to actually have a name and a history. Charles Moore and Henry D. were murdered by the Franklin County, Mississippi Klan on May 2nd, 1964. Their bodies were sunk in the Old River next to the Mississippi River that same day. Moore's body was noticed by fishermen on July 12th. D's body was recovered by the FBI the following day. Their disappearance and grisly murder was covered by local and national media. The FBI also carefully researched the case. In fact, the FBI report was used to prosecute and convict James Ford Seal nearly 43 years later. Many thought their bodies were in fact the bodies of Goodman, Schwerner, and Cheney when they were first discovered. 58 years after their kidnapping and murder, many are still making the unsubstantiated claim that unnamed Black bodies were discovered that summer. That claim, I argue in my book project, functions rhetorically to push back against the centering of Goodman, Schwerner, and Cheney, whose memory, as Shared Legacies reproduces, still dominates the larger Freedom Summer narrative. And I'm happy to talk more about this in the Q&A. So to close, thank you, Barbara, for inviting me. This is fantastic. It's a fantastic film. It's a great place to start a conversation on these 2 terribly important traditions that feed each other so much during the civil rights movement. And I look forward to what my colleagues have to say as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Houck. I would love to hear more about that project. I listened to the CBC podcast about it and the documentary.
Right.
Just with absolutely amazing, incredible. Nik, I was hoping that you could share with us, you have kind of a unique connection, or at least a little bit unusual, I think, connection to this content. And I would love to hear a little bit about your story and also any thoughts on the film.
Thank you, Jenny, and thank you for inviting me to be here. I feel incredibly lucky to be a part of this panel with these amazing panelists. My name is Nik Harris. I do feel connected to this work first and foremost because I'm a person and I care about other people. And I think that genuinely matters. I was blessed enough in 2019 to actually take a mission trip to Israel with a Wider Bridge, a Jewish organization that does outreach in the LGBTQ community to literally build bridges between communities. Prior to that, I have too many Jewish friends that I consider not just friends, but family. And so for me, I've never been a person who tolerates any level of hate in my presence. And that applies to anti-Semitism. For me, watching this movie, and I want to say I've had the opportunity to serve on a panel with the director, Dr. Sherry Rogers, who just did a phenomenal job with this movie. I want to say this, I had such conflicting emotions as I watched it. You know, I had such joy learning or relearning about a story I thought I knew, well enough and realized I didn't, as well as so much sadness that 60 years later, we're still grappling with these same issues. And so if you had the opportunity not just to watch the movie, but you watch the trailer, one of the things they say is, and we know this, if we don't learn from our history, we're doomed to repeat it. As I just listened to the previous panelists share about the amount of attention that Schwerner, Goodman, and Cheney received, it's interesting to me when we talk about the number of Black lives that were lost, but that was what it took to galvanize the country's attention. And yet here it is, and we're in 2021, and we still see that same thing. You know, for me, I can run the parallel between the civil rights movement and Black Lives Matter now and go that we're still having these same issues. We're still grappling with, do Black lives really matter? And so what I appreciate most is that what we find is like the statement that if we don't learn from our history, we'll repeat it. We're already repeating it. We already know that most Americans, we don't really learn the history of America. We don't really talk about the alliances between Black and Jewish communities and how important that was then and how important it is now. I would like to say this: a lot of times when you see people discussing this particular issue, we have to liken it in some ways to a race issue, but there are 7 million Jews in America and 1 million of them are non-white. So this isn't an issue that just affects white people. You have to care about this issue because you have to care about not only other non-white Jews, but all people. And so there's far more that connects us than separates us. And so I get excited that there's so much that we can do, and there are new leaders coming up now who come together in community. It's what I see us doing every day in the work that I do to achieve LGBTQ rights. There are LGBTQ Jews who also, we have to care about all of these issues and the intersectionality of them. So when I say I'm so pleased with this film, but I pray that in 60 more years, we aren't still having this same conversation, having to learn about a previous history, but able to phrase it and look at it of what we were currently able to do by coming together. And so with that, I'll pass it on to the other panelists.
Thank you, Nik. That was powerful, and I'm glad that you raised the issue of Jews of color, and that I think too often we talk about the Black community and the Jewish community as if these are separate communities, and we don't see the overlap, and that 20% of American Jews are self-identify as Jews of color. And you're right, if Jewish people aren't talking about that, then we are leaving out a significant portion of our own community. And of course, we are ignoring our own humanity and the common humanity that we all share. And I was struck by, I think it was Reverend Vivian in the film who said, and this reminded me, I guess, about your comments about Black Lives Matter and the 60 years. And he said, and speaking as a Black man, he was saying there hasn't been a time in this country that we have been free. And I just found that, to think about that in 2021, powerful. So thank you. And Doby, I would like to turn it over to you and hear your reflections on the film and your personal connections to these issues.
Doby, you gotta unmute.
Yeah, can you unmute?
Okay.
Zoom.
The film as well, and I think Dr. Houck and the previous speaker have summarized the film very well. For me, I'm probably the only one on this panel who lived the film. At 72 years old, I knew Martin Luther King. I was hugged by Martin Luther King. I grew up with C.K. Steele as my pastor, so King came a lot. I grew up in the civil rights movement. And I grew up in the time when, yes, Black people were murdered in this area. and beaten, etc. So I lived the history of the film, and I was aware of all the killings during that time. So the film really codified things that I had experienced and things that I already knew. And it's interesting that the view of the Black community and the Jewish community, because as a little girl, I always thought Jews were different. There were white people, then there were Jews, then there were Black people. We didn't consider the Jews as being white because they were different. There was a relationship. We knew that from a little girl that their holidays were different because the stores were closed. And the relationship between the Black community and the Jewish community, you can say it's things such as this are small, but they're not. The Jewish stores were the only stores where Black people could try on clothes in the store. You may not realize storekeepers would let you take clothes home, but you couldn't try on the stuff in the store. So the Jewish stores were the people who gave us credit, who treated us as human beings. So there was always this connection between the Black community, at least in the South for me, between the Black community, and it was the everyday connection. What we did, we were close, and we didn't consider, as I said, there were white people, and there were Jewish people, and there was Black people. And we had a distinct kind of definition. And even the Jewish people tend to have dark hair, they kind of look kind of like us, you know. So there was a close relationship in the community on day-to-day things. I met rabbis, I met people in the movement as a little child all my life. So that as I had the benefit of meeting all these people, icons, whether it was Jesse or Andrew Young, Martin Luther King, C.K. Steele, I knew and grew up with these leaders. So I think that they helped frame who I am today and my worldview on the relationship of Blacks and Jews. It kind of was a little different when I went to New York, because when I was in Tallahassee, we only knew Jews. When I got up there, there was different kind of Jews, and they were all in their own neighborhood. So that was a different kind of experience than I had been used to in the South. And I would say that in the South, I felt a closer relationship. I saw a closer relationship between the Black community and the Jewish community. And even in terms of going back to when I was crowned homecoming queen, I'll never forget this. Turner's dressed me.
Sorry you broke up there, Doby.
I said Turner's clothing store, who were Jews. They dressed me for homecoming day. They were proud. They wanted me to look the best, because for them, I was breaking the color line and the ethnic line. And then I saw how proud they were in making sure that I looked the best on that day. So we had those kind of relationships as a child growing up. And there were so many relationships. I was saying to Barbara that many people don't know that the plane and the pilot of the plane of Martin Luther King was Lance Block's father. I don't know his first name, I just called him Mr. Block. But here was a man in the Deep South who piloted Martin Luther King all over as a contribution to the civil rights movement. And I was so happy that Leon County recognized him before he died. But people don't know those kind of stories, but they're out there. So I'll kind of stop talking, but that's my relationship. There's nothing in the film that surprised me, that I could not remember the incident. I mean, not like the Holocaust going back, but during the civil rights movement, and because my mother was very much involved and my church was very much involved, I lived what you saw. And it has had a tremendous impact on who I am and how my worldview was formed. So yes, the film was very touching for me, but was not necessarily shocking, but it's a good codification and documentation of my life experiences.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to bring it back to local history here in Florida, especially, which I don't think gets talked about as much outside of Florida or even within Florida as a center of racism and Jim Crowism and, you know, terror and violence, in the same way that we hear about Mississippi and Alabama and other places. But I found it fascinating in the film, the letter from the rabbis in St. Augustine was something I had not heard about. And then Kivy Kaplan's trip to Florida, the vacation where he was, you know, struck by the "No Jews or Dogs Allowed" signs here in Florida.
Right.
It just, it's, I think people don't understand how very, very bad it was here.
Right, and I think when people are oppressed in any way, even though you may have more money or whatever, there's a commonality that brings you closer together. And Jews were not accepted in our community, you know? And just like you say, you saw the signs that said "No Jews and no dogs." And when I came back, giving you another story, I don't know how, so a lot of times this does not go away. When we relocated W.R. Grace to Boca Raton, and the HR person said to me, "Thank God we can finally say Merry Christmas." And I knew I was with the wrong group of folk. Because in New York, you say Happy Holidays, because it's a holiday and you're expecting everybody. And she said, "Thank God we can finally say Merry Christmas." And I just said, you know, really, I'm with the wrong people. And that's why I ended up back in Tallahassee, because, you know, that statement said something to me. You know, it said something about the intolerance of diversity, you know, the respect of cultures. And so those little things are still creeping in, and they creep in at all levels that people really don't understand that, you know, there's still this bias. There's still the bias against Jews. And there's still clearly with the Black Lives, with what we're experiencing now, you know, it's just a deja vu for me. You know, when is enough enough? You know, I was on a panel with a young lady at FSU, and she was very proud, and she said, well, you know, her experience at FSU had just been so great, and she said, and I'm a first generation college graduate with pride. And I said to her, how far have we gone? I said, my grandmother graduated from college. And here we are all these years later, and you're the first generation to go to college. It felt as if the clock was turning backwards. And then you have to say, how far have we gone? How far have we moved from what you saw in the film? And it's just, how do we build those coalitions together again to pursue human rights for all people?
So I see there's a question in the chat about the Jewish community in the South during this time. And I wondered, Dr. Houck, as our resident academic, if you know anything about this, and I really don't.
I don't. The question is kind of a quantity question. How big, how prevalent, and I just don't know.
Mm-hmm.
I think it was pretty small. relatively small at the time. I'm only here 30 years, so I don't have that long history, but it's still considered a small Jewish community. And it's actually transplants. You have a lot of people that didn't come from here that are Jewish. So it's really, we're still a very small part of the city, actually.
Where is the concentration in Florida?
Mostly
South Florida.
South Florida.
It's South Florida. And when you said Boca, I'm
Mhm.
like, that lady does not know where she's going, because that's where all my Jewish students at Hillel come from. They come from Boca, but
But you know, the
anyway.
town center would not put up a menorah
Mm,
when I was in Boca.
wow.
They would not. You know, it's like I went to a Mideastern restaurant in Boca, and on the off season, you know, there's nobody there. And I went there and I, you know, ate by myself. Second time I went to the Mediterranean. So the man says, how come you like our food? I said, well, you know, I lived in New York and lived in Brooklyn, da 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 da. He said, but how come your people not like my food? I said, what people? He said, you the only black person come to my restaurant. I said, I'm the only black person in Boca. And that's how few blacks were in Boca. But there's a lot of Jewish, there was a concentration of Jewish population. But like I say, there was a fight over whether menorah could be placed in town center, in the shopping mall. So that bias was still there. And hopefully it's improved, but it was there.
You know, Debbie, I go to Boca a lot. I own a place there, and
Mhm.
it's changed now.
Mhm.
However, that's how I feel Tallahassee is now. That we still have to come far for understanding the diversity of who being Jewish and not Jewish, because you wouldn't think of putting a menorah, not you wouldn't think, but I would be surprised to find a menorah in Tallahassee, actually, in the you know, in the mall. So,
But if you ask, you may get it.
well, that's
This is a controversy where they had asked, and they said, you know, the whole controversy, no, you couldn't put it up. So in Tallahassee, I think you probably would have gotten a different response.
you are right, yes. But it's still small town compared to the other parts of the lower.
Right, right.
Yes. But it's definitely, you know, you got the Northeast and then the Southern, there's a lot of looking into the Southern towns of how the Jews migrated here down many years ago. And the businesses were started by a lot of Jewish people, and that's really how it went forward with the, how they managed here. So, and then that's the connection.
And that's how I learned the rich history, you know, about the holidays and what they meant and all of that, you know, because of the merchants, you know. So our cultures crossed.
Exactly.
And I don't want to say I have you know, like people say, I have a lot of black people friends. I have in Tallahassee a lot of Jewish friends. And I respect them tremendously. I hate to say, you know, that, but I do. And I feel still close, very, very close to them.
Doby, I was wondering if I could ask you a question.
Sure.
So when you were growing up and you were a kid and then you were a teenager and then a young woman at Florida State and you were involved in the movement, in studying the movement from an academic point of view, I've always been interested in this rhetorical tradition where ministers call on, especially, and it's mentioned in the film, kind of this Old Testament prophetic voice, right? This, Dr. King did. I mean, Dr. King was always in the Old Testament more than the New Testament, it strikes me. And I'm wondering, in your experience, as you sat in as a young person in the movement, to what extent preachers and other clergy called on certain Old Testament themes to activate people to get in the streets, to go to jail. It seemed, and the reason I asked the question is because I see a lot of religious rhetoric in the movement.
Mhm.
And it's coming from all kinds of traditions, right? It's coming from priests, it's coming from rabbis, it's coming from Baptists, it's coming from everywhere. There's not just no tradition owns the movement in terms of its sort of prophetic voice. And I'm just wondering if you could comment on that as you heard C.K. Steele, as you heard Dr. King, as you heard others use the moral authority of the scriptures to activate you and others.
Well, you know, like you say, I heard their voices through the Old Testament, and you're right. It's usually the Old Testament that I heard. And one thing about C.K. Steele and others, especially with the student movement, they understood the power of students. And what they did was give us the tools to lead. And they were unselfish about that. I remember even with Stokely Carmichael trying to come to Tallahassee.
You just muted yourself, Doby.
Okay, I remember when Stokely Carmichael came to speak, and our church would not allow that. You know, he was too militant, he was this. And Reverend Steele said, we will listen to our young people. If he can't come to Bethel Baptist, I will find a church. But we have to listen to the young people. So when you think about Martin Luther King and C.K. Steele, not only did we follow them and their precepts and their teachings, but later on, we were the leaders in the student movement.
Mm-hmm.
So that every time we would do something, we would pray, you know, Black people pray. And before we took action, we would pray. And like I said, most of it was in the Old Testament, interesting enough.
Mm-hmm.
So the motivation and our support and our not being afraid really came from the teachings of Reverend Steele and Martin Luther King.
Yeah, and then you look at an organization like SNCC in Mississippi, which almost kind of ran away from the church,
right?
Because the church is this very hierarchical thing, right? And but your comment about organizing the youth reminded me of Bob Moses when somebody asked him many years later, how did you organize Mississippi? And he said, with a ball. And of course, the interviewer's like, what are you talking about with a ball? Well, you start bouncing a ball, you get the kids to come out.
That's right.
And then eventually the ball's going to go in the gutter by the house, and mom and dad are going to come out. And that's when you start talking to mom and dad about the ball being in the gutter, but who you are and why you're there. And I just found that very interesting because in Mississippi, right, you had teenagers, and then you had 50, 60, and 70-year-olds.
Right.
And there's kind of this whole middle generation that was missing, which is interesting to talk about why that might be. But yeah, Bob Moses is with you on this. Is like you organize through kids.
Right. And that's and I think because, you know, many of the time when I think of, and we used to say, some of the very people who did not participate out of fear or whatever, were some of the very people who could afford to go to the places that, because of the movement, opened it up to them. So many of the people who were better off financially were not the people necessarily involved in the movement. And so in terms of the student movement, it was just a time, you know. It was a, oh boy, oh, my cat about to get in a fight with a cat outside. Hold on just a moment.
Well, I wanted to just note that we don't have very long left, and we have two. I will say our question askers in the chat are going for like the big questions. We could spend an hour on each of these questions. The first question is, can the panelists speak about the anti-Semitism among young Black people today? And I just want to push that question a little bit and say, can we talk about the, you know, racism that exists across society, including within the Jewish community? where we know there's plenty of racism, including against our own, and our own being Jews of color. And just on a very side note, I'll give a plug for a Hillel program that's coming up in a few weeks, where we're going to have Ethiopian Jews in Israel come and speak to us about their experiences being Jews of color from the Jewish diaspora in Africa, and then moving to Israel and what that is like. So that's a whole other lens on race that is going to be fascinating. So look for our social media on that. Anyway, I'd love to hear maybe Nik, you've had some experiences in Israel, and I think and sort of in this space, and maybe I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
Thank you for that, and thank you for making that clarification. I don't mean this in a bad way, but I sort of cringe when I see questions like that, in the sense of anti-Semitism among young Black people. That's not my experience. And I have to say that to folks, and I do this work in community. Have I heard anti-Semitic comments by individual people at some point? Sure, and you call it out. But the idea that somehow overwhelmingly or overall young Black people are anti-Semitic, I think is just simply not true. That's not the experience. And what I want to say, there is no community is monolithic. And so as long as you have anti-Semitism, racism across society, you will have members of any group who will then, espouse those beliefs. But I think that's part of it for us to recognize that when you are in a lot of these communities with young Black folks doing this work, I have not experienced that, and many people I know across the country don't experience that. But a lot of times that one person gets the attention. They suck all the air out of the room. And so I am going to look down at my notes, because I do want to say this. Almost 50% of Black Americans have a favorable view on Israel. About a third said they weren't sure, and the remaining percentage said they had an unfavorable view. 52% of Black Americans support Israel's statehood. 18% said they disagreed. The remaining were unsure. 70% of Black Americans said they empathize with the hardships of Israelis and Palestinians. I think, again, and I heard this on one of the panels, and so I want to say this. Black people in America tend to focus more so on domestic policy than foreign policy. But this idea that somehow Black people are anti-Semitic, or somehow young Black people are, that again is not my experience. And until we can root out racism, anti-Semitism in America, then you'll see it among any group. But as I am out doing work in community, it's called out when it's said, and that's all any of us can continue to do. And so I think we again, when I began by saying we have more in common than we do that separates us, what happened at Mother Emanuel Church and what happened at Tree of Life affected both of our communities. And we came together as a country and communities to support one another. If you go back and look at both of those, you had Jewish people showing up for Mother Emanuel in support of that church and to condemn what had happened there. You saw the same thing among Black leaders at Tree of Life. So sometimes I would just ask us to take a step back and let's not paint an entire community with a broad brush.
Thank you.
What I've seen and all heard in conversations, had this conversation with a group of students, and their view was they were not anti-Semitic, but they questioned anything about Israel, they became labeled, and that was just like, they couldn't talk about Israel unless they totally agreed with the position of Israel. And they don't, they didn't like that. They wanted an open discussion. But they said that's almost impossible. If you say something about Israel or something about the Palestinian rights, then you're anti-Semitic. And they're saying, well, wait a minute, So it's not tolerated to have those open discussions. And maybe some of that ends up being considered as anti-Semitic. But I've not noticed that.
I would say in my work with young people on the campus, that what I have seen is that there is a significant amount of anti-Semitism on the right and the left, on the far extremes. And it does, especially in the left, show up around Israel. That sort of gets where it is. But I think also sometimes people, especially on college campuses, and young people who are just kind of, you know, like going along to get along, just doing whatever they can to sort of fit in and still figuring things out. And they may say things or retweet things, or, you know, that they don't really understand even the words that they're saying. And so I think if we sort of paint them with the label of, you know, racist when they're 20 years old and they're still figuring out and still learning, that's sad too, and that we need to be able to engage in dialogue.
Well, you can be a racist. You can be a racist at any age.
Definitely.
So if you find a racist at 20, you got to deal with that racist. They will continue to be a racist till they 50.
Yeah.
So, you know, everybody can grow, but that doesn't mean you tolerate where they are when you find them.
Absolutely. I'm really pleased that at Hillel we've just started our first ever Black Jewish Leadership and Learning Cohort, and we have 12 students. About half identify as Black, about half identify as Jewish, some as both and other identities as well. Leaders on campus and meeting to build this kind of community. And I looked for models for this, and you know, I'm so pleased to see it in the film, and yet I couldn't find a guide to how to do this anywhere. And so we're just making it up as we go. Some of the students are here in the audience today. And in fact, one of those students has asked a question, and maybe that will be our last question, which is, and it's a big one, does supporting Israel and supporting civil rights go hand in hand? Thanks, Leos, you took us right to right to the heart of the matter. I think we see some other things here about Jews and Palestinians, and that's where some of this comes in. But anyway, I wonder what anyone has to say about sort of civil rights and what's happening with the conflict, if anything.
Well, you know, I feel that a country, an entity, a person is capable of doing right things and wrong things. And when that person or entity is doing something wrong, they should be called out on it. And that is not necessarily tied to civil rights. The issue is human rights. It's broader than that. So it's not tied to Israel and civil rights as a binary you know, situation. Israel is a country. The civil rights movement is a fight for justice for everybody and has no identity, you know, like has a seamless identity. That's the way I see it. It's broad, it cuts across everything, where Israel is an entity and the support of Israel is there. And when Israel is wrong, the support is withdrawn. But all entities and people are capable of doing both. And I don't think civil rights and Israel, that's synonymous. Those are two different things.
I agree with Doby, and I just wanted to add a minute of my feelings that the Middle East and Israel is very, very complicated.
Mm-hmm.
And people don't know what they don't know.
Right.
And it's very easy to make a judgment on what they support or what they don't support with knowing very little information. The political climate in the Middle East is very important, but unless people know a lot about it, I think they should really understand that it's not the time to criticize it. And it's not civil rights. I mean, civil rights is human rights, as Doby said. It's not Palestinian rights or Israeli rights, it's human rights. And people have to look into the broader picture of the whole world. Israel is not the global world.
And you know, just to give you an example, in this fragmentation among the Jewish people, when I was working in Boston, my boss was Jewish, and we hired this consultant who was also Jewish, but he was Sephardic. Brilliant, brilliant guy. And I remember this meeting where my boss just dismissed him. You know, it's like, you're nothing. He was very dark. And then he looked at my boss's bookcase and he looked back and said, I see you read my books. Yeah. And he said something in Arabic. And I asked him, what did you say? He says, because he had done the work that the other people couldn't figure out how to do. And he said this in Arabic. And I asked him, what did you say? He says, when the black man has finished the work, he can be dismissed. So that showed me, even among the Jewish community, they had this fragmentation. And this man came from royalty. You know, he had to flee, and they ended up in Israel. But they ended up in a tent, and his father was way up, you know, and they ended up in a tent. So there was discrimination even within, that a lot of the people in charge came from Germany and different places. But for this Sephardic Jew, who was wealthy before he had to flee his country, ended up sleeping on the floor. So that just like, when he said that, even though I didn't think of him as being black, but that's what his proverb said. So even within that, I saw a window of, you know, how we discriminate against each other because we're different.
I was nervous to wade into that question, so I'll say to Doby and Barbara, I appreciate that answer. I would sort of say, and I think Doby did sum it up, but I would say I'm not sure I have an answer. I don't think necessarily anything has to go hand in hand with anything else. What I would say is, if you care about civil rights for people, then that means you care about the plight of people living in Israel. That means you care about the plight of people living in Palestine. And so I go, it could, but it could not. I don't know really how to answer that. I'm a person who would love for both entities to figure out a two-state solution. And so I believe in the freedom of all people. So and I support civil rights. So that's why I say that's a really difficult question to answer, but I guess I would lean towards not necessarily.
That's a good point. So Golda Meir once said, the former prime minister of Israel, she says, if we stop shooting, there won't be an Israel. If they stop shooting, there'll be peace.
Really?
Wow.
Okay.
Well, that was one of her
quotes.
Her comments, her thoughts, right? But it just goes back it's a long history. How did two different people, even in the same country, get along?
Right. And going back to the relationship of Jews and blacks, it was a black man that negotiated the creation of Israel. That negotiated oversaw the whole creation. So there you go, another connection.
Right.
The Nazis study Jim Crow. I mean,
right. There's a connection right there. You're right, Nik.
Right, how our communities come together.
Yeah.
Right.
And they learned about, oh my gosh, I'm going to blank on the word now.
You're too young for that.
Yeah. I have 2 young children. I blame it on them. Well, I think we're about at time, and we should probably wrap up. I wanted to just share a quote from the film that really stuck with me, from Dr. Michael Berenbaum, who said, once a person has been enslaved, once a culture has been enslaved, you can leave slavery, but it never leaves you.
Absolutely.
The echo of that remains, the vulnerability of that remains. and so too the promise and great realization that we can be free. And here comes my cat.
Oh, you have one too. I left the door open for my cat to get some breeze, and I guess a cat came to the door.
Well, mine's sitting right here next to me. I'm petting him.
Oh, okay. You know, I kind of let him go and come her, and I guess somebody was chasing him back in the door.
Tommy wants to say hi.
And,
Hi, Tommy.
and I've got another one back there on the bed. But yeah, I thought that was a nice, just, I don't know, a nice connection to make. I think even that you could push on. But here we are in Black History Month. Next month, in about 1 month, we will be at the beginning of Passover, the Jews' remembrance of their escape from slavery and exodus from Egypt. So I thought that was a very kind of a nice way to bring us to this moment. I just want to thank everybody. Barbara, I don't know if you have any final words for us.
I want to thank the panelists. I want to thank Chase for the technical support. I'm thanking the that attended. And my message from this film, I want to hear everybody's last message, is that we should stand up. Don't be silent.
Yes.
Always do the right thing, and that's how we can change the world for a better place, hopefully.
Yep. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you for inviting us.
Thank you for everybody for being here tonight. Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.